I realized then that I had broken the bolts on the other side of the door, which were brittle with rust. Horrified at having broken a door lock on my very first day, I was about to turn around and run from the scene, and just ask someone to help me find my class. I obviously shouldn't be in this part of the school. The new corridor was old and dusty. The lockers were all hanging open and unused. A faint smell of mold hung in the air. As I turned, I noticed the numbers painted on the glass windows of the doors along the corridor. The one closest to me read 100. Perplexed, I checked my schedule again to assure myself that I had read my class number correctly. It was very clear. My room was 104. And just along this corridor, apparently. I began to walk slowly, looking into the windows of each class I passed. 100. Empty. 101. Empty. 102. Empty, except for a plastic skeleton hanging in the corner by a pile of yellowing student lab coats. Still, it was enough to make me flinch. As I checked 103, which was empty, of course, I heard the voice of an adult man coming from the room opposite. Room 104. I peeked through the window. Full. Except it wasn't what I expected to see. Sure, there was a teacher wearing a worn brown suit with a blue necktie. And there were students, all focused on this teacher sitting apart from one another on old-fashioned wooden desks. What made me pause for a brief moment was what they were wearing. Kids didn't dress like that anymore. It looked like a classroom from an old film or show. The teacher stood beside a blackboard, dusty from chalk. Despite this oddity, I knocked on the door. I assumed the school just had a poor budget. The teacher didn't notice my knocking, so I quietly opened the door and walked in. None of the students took their gaze away from the teacher, who also paid no attention to me. I awkwardly apologized for my tardiness, citing that I had gotten lost. I then made my way over to the only free seat in the classroom and sat down. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. I must have interrupted the class, I thought. The teacher began his lesson a few seconds later, rather casually. His name was Mr. Talori. He began to chalk equations on the board and got the class to solve them. The lesson was rather ordinary, aside from the fact that no calculators were used. Whenever I raised my hand to answer a question, almost to try and win back favor from the teacher, he ignored it and always chose another student to answer the problem. The lesson ended abruptly after what felt like hours. By the end of it, I was bored and miserable. I just wanted to get home and complain about the way I was ignored all day. When I left the room, I felt pains of hunger. I glanced at my watch and was shocked to see that the school day had ended. An entire day of math class. The horror. I had decided I hated that school. I slowly walked home, going over the day's events in my mind. It was all very surreal, but I supposed I would get used to this new school eventually. When I arrived home, my mother was talking on the phone. Her face displayed confusion. She heard me come in and grimaced when she saw me. She appeared somewhat angry and asked whoever was on the other end of the phone to hold on a second. And then she accused me of skipping school. Confusion immediately followed. I told her I was in class all day, but apparently the school had phoned to say I wasn't in any lessons and hadn't seen me after I collected my schedule. I told her I was in Mr. Talori's classroom in room 104 all day. I must have missed roll call when I was late, I thought. My mom paused and told the school on the phone my story. Her expression froze after a few seconds, and then she looked at me rather worriedly. She hung up the phone and told me what the school had said. Mr. Talori had not worked at that school in 38 years. Apparently, room 104 was part of an abandoned section of the school that hadn't been used since a school shooting nearly 40 years ago. The school thought I was playing some kind of sick joke. That night, I went on the internet to find out if what the school had said was true. Quickly, I found old newspaper articles about the school massacre that had been archived. Apparently, a madman had simply walked into the school with a hunting rifle and shot an entire class dead. He had blocked the doorway and shot everyone in a math classroom. An old, grainy photo showed the class where the massacre happened. I recognized it immediately. It was room 104. An obituary showed tributes to the dead and photos of all that had died. I recognized all of them. Mr. Talori and all the students I had spent the entire day with. My heart felt like it had stopped. I felt sick. I felt cold to my bones at that very moment. After that day, I changed schools. Now, years later, I've written this. My account of what happened to me, which nobody ever believed. The reason for my writing this now? Yesterday, I received a letter in the mail. There was no address. It had simply appeared through my mailbox. It was a class reunion invitation. And it was signed by my old math teacher, Mr. Talori.
Your time has come.
Ever wondered if things can just be born evil? In this enlightened age of ours, concepts like good and evil are often painted as outmoded, archaic even. According to modern thought, people, animals too obviously, are simply products of their environment, and no more responsible for their actions than a twig in a stream. But I know better. Some things are just born bad. About 10 years ago, we had a German shepherd named Duchess, who had a litter of puppies, 7 in all. 6 of them looked like any other shepherd you have ever seen before. The 7th was a snowy white.
Not a true albino, just white-furred with a black nose and blue eyes. There was never any doubt about which one we were going to keep out of that litter. We named her Princess. Before the end of 6 months, any plans we had about giving away or selling the others became a moot point, as all of the other puppies were dead. We just find them at a rate about 1 a month. Not mangled or anything, just dead as if they died in their sleep. At first, we thought maybe their mother, it being her first litter and all, was accidentally crushing or smothering them. Later, we had no doubt as to what had killed them. Within a year, she came to dominate her mother, her father, tough old alpha that he was, and to a degree, us too. Her parents shied away from her. When we put their food out, she ate until her heart's content, unchallenged by the other two. One time I tried to shoo her away and let the other two eat. She snarled at me, baring those perfect white fangs to her incongruously black gums, and loosing a growl so deep that I felt it in my stomach more than in my ears. After that, I left her alone too. I've often wondered if the parents of serial killers know they have a monster in the making. I mean, sure, some of them are to blame for how their kids turned out, products of messed up households with systematic abuse of all possible flavors. But then there are ones that seem to be true aberrations. It's those families that I'm curious about. Do they smile and laugh and pretend that everything's fine? I know that we sure did. We downplayed the weirdness around Princess, tried to rationalize her behavior, the bizarre things she'd do, like killing rabbits and leaving them hung up in the bushes behind our house. Some dogs do that to show they love you. Cats too, my father would say. To them, it's just bringing you a gift. But to me, it looked like she was taunting us. Just like the puppies years earlier. Not one of those rabbits ever had a mark on it. Princess, just like her mom and dad, was well looked after and never hurt for a meal. So it wasn't as if she were hunting for food. Her innumerable kills were always untouched. No. The only thing I ever saw her eat was a kitten. We had some feral cats in the woods around our house, and one mama cat had a litter in our tool shed. Feral really is stretching it. Most of them were tame enough to be petted, this mama being among them. I returned home from school one day and headed around back to look in on them. The door to the shed was open, and inside, I found Princess, her jaws pink from her feast. As she devoured that last kitten, her beautiful blue eyes never left mine. The mother we found displayed on what I'd come to think of as the rabbit bush. The tipping point came that same year when we found her sire dead. He was the best dog that we ever had, that we ever will have. We awoke one Saturday morning to find him in the backyard, lying dead, without a single mark like so many rabbits before him. I can count the number of times I have ever saw my father cry on one hand. This was one of them. That was also when we found out how she killed so cleanly. She would strangle her prey. Like a jaguar, the fur at her father's neck was still wet with her saliva. We spent that morning burying that good old faithful dog. And then he sent me and my mom away on some pretense. No words were spoken, but there was no doubt about what he intended to do. I'm sure there are some of you listening to this that will find the notion of putting an animal down to be abominable. But what other options did he have, really? Take her to an animal shelter? Give her to some other family? Who could do that and go to sleep with a clear conscience? As it turned out, we weren't getting any sleep that night regardless of our decision. We spent that afternoon at my uncle's house. Once, when I came in from playing to get a glass of water, I overheard my mom telling my uncle that she sometimes wondered if the dog was possessed or something. I'd sometimes wondered the same thing. Later that evening, not long before sunset, we got a call from Dad. Apparently, the deed was done. By the time we arrived home, he had already washed up and changed clothes. But there was little he could have done to hide his wounds, even less to hide the haunted look in his eyes. Both his arms and one leg were bandaged, and that was bad enough. But what stuck with me all these years later was just how terrified he looked. It wasn't until I joined the army and been through combat that I recognized that expression. It's how men look after they stared death straight in the face. My father never talked about it, but he had drafted a friend from up the street to come help him, and it's from him that I get this part of the story. Princess was many things, bloodthirsty and evil chief among them, but stupid wasn't one. In that, if nothing else, she took after her father. Her dad, Rocky, was famous for letting himself into the house when it was storming out. He had figured out how to paw open the sliding glass door out to the patio. What was really astounding is that he also had the presence of mind to close it behind him. Not being stupid, she knew something was up and made herself scarce, disappearing into the woods. Dad, not wanting to put this off and being in full-on revenge mode, called his friend from down the road and filled him in. So off on the hunt, the two of them went. In his own words, she was waiting for us. If it sounds absurd to say that Princess wait in ambush, then I have failed at conveying just how wrong everything about her truly was. She led them on a chase through the woods, barking whenever it seemed the stupid humans had lost her again. Then, she laid up beneath an overhang on the creek bank, just where the path crossed it, and waited. She was on my father the instant he stepped down into the creek, grabbing his leg and making him fall headfirst into the water. Then she went straight for his throat. My dad had already lost his rifle at that point, and he grabbed her with both hands, trying to fend her off, wrestling with 115 pounds of teeth claws and muscle in a foot and a half of water. Princess, savaging his arms all the while. At some point, he managed to work his legs up between him and the dog and kicked her away from him, providing his friend with a clean shot, which he took, catching Princess through the chest. He put a second round through her head, point blank. He then helped my dad back home into the emergency room, telling him he'd go back to see after Princess once they got home. She can rot where she is, was all my dad had to say on that subject. After they got back from the hospital, our neighbor went back on his ATV to pick up Princess for burial. He was a dog lover just like us, and it just didn't seem right to him to leave her there. If he'd spent as much time tiptoeing around as we had, he might have felt differently. She just wasn't there, he said. No blood trail, nothing. He also said that after he had been there poking around for a few minutes, he noticed something else strange. No birds. It was dead quiet, the way the woods get sometimes, right before a bad storm blows in. Wisely, he got the hell out of there. There was a storm coming, all right. That night, Duchess came pawing at the back door, wanting in. Something she'd never once done in all the time she had been with us. And that night I had a dream. In it, I was playing football in the backyard with some buddies and ran over to where a bad throw had landed near Rocky's grave. As I reached for it, Princess's head shoved up out of the ground and grabbed my hand. I woke up with a jolt and was promptly scared out of roughly 10 more years of my life by the silhouette of a German Shepherd in the hallway. It was Duchess, of course. She was sitting in the hallway whining and wagging her tail nervously. She was looking back towards the front of the house. I walked over to her and placed my hand on her head and said, "What is it, girl?" That's when I heard it. I heard the distinctive sound of claws on glass. Something was pawing at the patio door. Thoroughly terrified, I grabbed Duchess by the collar and dragged her along with me to my parents' room, shutting the door behind me. I was 14. I was terrified. But even in that terror, retreating to my parents' room wasn't just for the security of Mommy and Daddy. That's where the guns were. I woke them up and told them what I had heard. "Sweet Jesus," my mother said. Dad got up and locked the bedroom door, telling us to lock ourselves in the bathroom. I heard the patio door slide open.
An enemy has been slain.
If any of the rest of us had any doubts about what had just come into the house, Duchess sure didn't. The only thing she ever feared in this world was her own puppy. A deep rumble of a growl vibrated in the floor beneath our bare feet, and Duchess's bladder let go as if on cue. Mine wasn't far from doing the same. What followed was a 6-hour exercise in pure terror, punctuated by snarling attacks on the bedroom door, crashes throughout the rest of the house as Princess found more things to break, whispered prayers from my mother, and litanies of curses from my father, as another of his attempted forays out of the bedroom were thwarted. We were without a phone, The one on my parents' nightstand was dead. We'd later find out that the phone line had been ripped out at the main box outside. My mom suggested that we try to make it to the car, and above and beyond everything else, it was my father's response to that idea that really scared me. Of the three of us, he was supposed to be the rational thinker. But what we got instead was, "Honey, I think that's what it wants us to do." As the world through the windows turned from black to gray, a hush fell over the entire house. Mom and I watched through the windows, craning our heads in an attempt to get an eye on the patio door. But try as we might, the best we could manage was a view of most of the patio. More than enough concealment for a dog to slink in or out of, even a big one like Princess. After an hour of silence, my dad quietly opened the bedroom door. I remember thinking what a useless gesture any attempt at stealth was. Dog senses are so much more acute than ours that he might as well have fired a 21-gun salute. Dad stopped in the hallway and shooed me back to the bedroom. "Don't come out until I say, okay?" Carefully, he made his way through the house to the patio door. We heard him shut it before he shouted back to us to stay in the bedroom till he told us to come out. Through the door, I could hear him moving around, and what seemed to be him dropping things into a garbage bag. After about 30 minutes, he gave us the all clear. What greeted us was a disaster. Ripped up cushions and pillows, destroyed furniture, shredded papers and books all over the floor. But most terrible were the smears of gore all over everything. My mother wondered aloud at what she had drug into the house. Grim-faced, my father did not answer. He simply turned and headed out back to rebury Rocky for a second time. We cleaned up as best we could, while Dad drove down to our neighbor's house to make all the appropriate calls. After all these years, I still wonder what portion of homeowners insurance covers attacks by undead demon ghost dogs. Unspoken, we all wondered what the night would bring. As it turned out, we never got a repeat. But Duchess never left the house again. Time rolled on. Occasionally, we'd find a new present on the rabbit bush. Just a friendly reminder. Another token of Princess's abiding love. About 2 years into college, my dad called me to tell me that our neighbor had passed away. Heart attack in his sleep, the coroner says. But what my dad and I were both thinking was, not a single mark on the body. There are plenty of nights where I wonder what the last thing was to pass before that old bachelor's eyes. And I can guarantee you, it stared right back at him. I've seen firsthand how it feeds. Not long after that, my folks put up the house for sale. I sort of acted as a go-between on that deal. About a week after the new owners moved in, I received a call from the man of the house. He wanted to know if we left any pets behind when we moved. Already fearing the answer, I asked him why he asked. "Oh, Me and the kids keep seeing this white shepherd in the woods. It's very pretty. Huh. Pretty.
Into the fray.
It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the sobbing echoed through the apartment complex. Everyone rushed outside to find Jacob, kneeling in front of a lifeless birch tree, crying. They stared in awe, unsure of what to do. After all, no one knew anything about him. The tenant stood shocked and confused as Jacob's finger dug into the soil at the base of the tree, scooping handfuls of dirt into his pockets. He continued until his pockets were full, then the crying ceased, just like that. The silence was so unnerving that some backed into their doorways, as if taking precautionary measure for an impending calamity. Dirt spilled from Jacob's pockets with each step as he slowly made his way back to his apartment. His movements were meticulous and deliberate. He seemed to savor each step like a mouthful of delicious food. Step after step, his neighbors watched with anticipation, not sure of what to expect, but sure something would happen. Though nothing did. This would be the last time anyone saw Jacob. Jacob was a strange old man. He would leave his apartment once a day for exactly an hour and stand in the courtyard talking to the ground near that old birch tree. No one really paid him much attention due to his age. An old man enjoying a quiet moment outside was really no cause for concern. He never spoke to anyone directly, and the conversations he had with the dirt were an incoherent string of babble. Everyone just assumed he was senile or suffering from any number of age-related mental disorders. His eyes were squinted, and from a distance it looked as if he had no eyes at all. Just emptiness behind the lids. That gave the kids plenty of reason to avoid him. They would try to scare each other and tell stories of how he was really a ghost, and how they had seen him perform numerous supernatural feats, even though none of them really had. The kids often played ding-dong ditch, and Jacob's door was a favorite target, even though he never answered. Nothing was known about Jacob, but rumors and gossip surrounded his origins. The strangest part about him was he only left for that hour. He would never leave the apartment grounds, not even for food or personal items. His rent showed up in the drop box on time, and other than being mysterious, he was honestly no trouble to anyone. No one had ever held a conversation with him in all the years he had lived there. Many residents tried, but he would just respond with, "Don't get dirty," and a closed-mouth smile. After a while, everyone just collectively assumed that he would be okay and just wanted to be left alone. The days turned into a week, and no one had seen Jacob. Residents began to assume the worst. He was old after all, and him dying wouldn't be a big surprise. But what happened that Sunday still resonated throughout the minds of all in attendance.
Ally has been slain.
After a week, William and Carter, the landlord and janitor, decided to check in on the old man. They approached Jacob's door cautiously as if he had been previously threatening. They didn't know why they were nervous. They had no reason to be. They tried but couldn't shake the feeling that something was just not right. They stood in front of his door, hesitant, both unsure of what to do next. Carter banged heavily on the door 3 times. They waited. But still, nothing happened. Carter banged again, and William yelled out, "Hey Jacob, you all right?" Silence filled the air. Carter cocked his head to the side, listening for any noise inside. "Anything?" William asked. Carter just shook his head. William removed the ring of keys from his pocket and inserted one into Jacob's door. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open, but to his surprise, it didn't budge. He pushed again, leaning his shoulder against the door. Slowly, the door slid open as William grunted and strained. He continued to push it until it was open just enough to enter. It was dark inside of the apartment. Not just the absence of light, but dark like the inside of a closed casket. The darkness was thick, and for a moment William thought about closing the door and just calling the police. Carter placed his hand on William's shoulder. "Are we just gonna stand here and stare?" he asked. William reluctantly squeezed through the cracked door into Jacob's apartment. The room didn't seem as dark once inside, and the light from the cracked door offered a small amount of visibility, but not much. The smell was unbearable. William covered his face with his shirt to try and block the smell. It was an indescribably moldy, sour blend of fermented filth. Carter gagged, but fought the urge to throw up. Behind the door, the refrigerator lay on its side, serving as a barricade. Carter wondered why Jacob would lock himself inside like that, and how such a frail old man could have moved the refrigerator alone. He pushed the thought to the side for a moment. Carter managed to drag the refrigerator away enough to fully open the front door, the light outside illuminating the living room and revealed a thick layer of dust and dirt covering the entire room. William couldn't believe it. The room looked like it hadn't been lived in for hundreds of years. Paint peeled from the walls, while the furniture was rotted and dilapidated. William called out to Jacob, but got no response. They stepped deeper into the apartment. Each step caused a small cloud of dust to stir up into the air. They checked the entire apartment, but found no one inside. Jacob had either left in the early hours of the morning or just disappeared into thin air. As they checked each room, they found the windows covered by cardboard and nailed shut. The same thick layer of filth covered every room and everything in them. Everything about Jacob was a mystery, and growing in strangeness by the second. In all 4 corners of every room sat a small glass jar. Each jar had a melted candle sitting atop of it. The candle remained stripped down the sides, partially obscuring the contents of the jar. Upon further inspection, the contents appeared to be dirt. The bedroom had the aforementioned jars in each corner as well, except in one of the corners sat a shrine. Glass jars formed a semicircle around several black and white photographs perched on a small wooden box. The largest one was a picture of a woman, with the face scratched out of it. The other pictures were of strange cryptids and horribly deformed people. At least, they looked like people. Some of the jars had liquid in them. Others had pieces of paper, buttons, feathers, insects, and dirt. Some jars were cloudy, and the contents were beyond recognition. Candles melted down to the base rested on top of each of them. Golden pendants with foreign shapes and symmetry draped over the shrine. Carter picked up one of the jars and held it close to his face. "What the hell is this?" he asked rhetorically. Something inside the cloudy jar scurried. He dropped the jar and stepped away, nervously wiping his hand on his pants. William leaned in and retrieved a handwritten note from under the broken jar. Loose soil spilled from the jar like entrails of a bloated, dead animal. He brushed the remaining dirt from the page with his hand. The note read, "From dirt we came, and to the dirt we shall return. The earth hungers for what is rightfully hers and grows impatient. The candle seals the jar, and the jar keeps them confined, keeps them trapped. If their prison is broken, avoid contact with the dirt at all costs. If it tastes your flesh, its thirst will not be quenched until it enslaves and consumes you. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. One by one they will come for us. Don't get dirty." They stared at the broken jar for a long moment. William looked down at his open palm. His hands were covered with dirt crumbs and dark smudges. He immediately rubbed his hand on the side of his pants. They knew what the letter was implying, but refused to accept it as anything more than the rambling delusions of an old man who had just lost his mind. As they thought it over, the whole situation seemed more and more impossible, but some subconsciousness cue caused them to repeatedly wipe the dirt off their hands. Even if this had all just been some old man's final slip from sanity, it still didn't explain where Jacob had gone to. All of the windows were nailed shut from the inside. The front door was locked and barricaded by the refrigerator. Unless Jacob was a ghost and could really walk through walls like the neighborhood kid suggested, there really was no other explanation. William laughed to himself at the thought. They pushed the supernatural thoughts out of their head and went back to work, cleaning the place up as quickly as they could. Carter loaded all of the shrine's contents, along with the jars in each room, into a box, and then tossed the box into the dumpster outside. The jars shattered as they hit the bottom of the dumpster. Carter stopped for a moment and thought of the letter. The letter bothered him, but he wasn't ready to succumb to Jacob's fantasy world that easily. As sunset approached, they retired to their own apartments. They did not speak of the strangeness of the day. Exhausted and eager to push it out of their minds, they quietly parted ways. Carter sat slumped in a worn but comfortable recliner, drifting in and out of consciousness. The television illuminated the room as a popular talk show host recited a string of witty jokes to an enthusiastic audience. A procession of heavy-handed knocks came from the front door. Carter came to life, eyes wide and foggy, still half asleep. "Yeah, who is it?" Carter yelled from the comfort of his chair. No answer. He waited a long beat, and as he began to ask again, he was interrupted by more knocking. The heavy thuds reverberated throughout the house. The banging on the door at such a late hour was startling, but the dead silence that followed bordered terrifying. Carter grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and approached the door. He leaned in towards the peephole, squinting his right eye. As he inched closer, he could slowly begin to make out a silhouette. Just before he could fully see the physical details, the visitor banged on the door again, this time shaking the door on its hinge. He jumped back, raising the hammer in his shaky hand. His heart pounded in his chest, breathing labored and body trembling. He stared at the door, and to his amazement and terror, the handle began to turn back and forth. It turned gently at first, but grew more and more violent with each turn. Carter stood paralyzed, until the deadbolt slowly began to turn to the open position. He rushed to the door, pressing his shoulder against it and turning the lock back to closed. The door shook violently as if someone were trying to knock it down. His body jerked with each and every impact. He slid up the door and gazed out through the peephole. His eyes widened with sheer panic as the view revealed what was on the other side of the door. The door continued to shake as Carter peered out into an empty hallway. There was no one there to take responsibility for the banging or attempted break-in. Just an empty hallway. This can't be, Carter thought. It's just not possible. His mind drifted back to the shrine in Jacob's house and the letter. He struggled to find answers, rational or supernatural. Just then, the banging stopped. He waited for a moment, certain that this was just a ploy for him to relax and let down his guard. He slowly rose to look out of the peephole again, not sure of what he was expecting to see. The phone rang loudly. He spun quickly with his hammer raised, only to realize it was nothing as sinister. He snatched the phone off the hook, and screaming erupted from the receiver. It was William, hysterically yelling into the phone. "They're trying to get in. I can't see them, but they're breaking in the windows and the doors, and I can't keep them out. Oh my God!" His voice grew more desperate. "Carter, listen to me. It was the jars. The letter. Jacob, I don't know what to do. Just don't let them inside. Oh my God. Oh God." The phone went dead. Carter held the phone to his ear in shock, shaking uncontrollably. The front doorknob began to shake and turn again. Carter rushed to the living room, just as the door began to open. He crashed against it, slamming it shut and turning the lock closed. Across the room, a window slowly creaked open. He grabbed it just in time, slamming it shut. The thought of Jacob's apartment came back. The refrigerator, the nailed windows, and the letter. He grabbed his couch and dragged it across the living room floor. He flipped it over and pinned it to the door. The door handle continued to turn back and forth. Hammer in hand, Carter grabbed a handful of nails out of his toolbox and began to nail the windows shut. The door banged violently against the couch, but he ignored it. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped 4 nails for every one he managed to hit with his hammer. He could barely hit a nail squarely on the head anyways. He bent several nails, missing others completely, hitting the windowsill. From the other side of the window, an unsettling, deformed face pressed against the glass. Carter screamed, jumping back, dropping the hammer, and falling to the ground. He couldn't reach the window in time, and it slowly slid open. A thick gust of dust and sand blew in, blanketing the area near the window. Carter scrambled across the floor on his hands and knees. He coughed and gasped for air as the dust continued to pour in. Every grain of sand seemed to be alive as it moved to each corner of the room, coating everything. Carter crawled towards the door, but the dust in the room made it hard to see or breathe. He tried to move the couch, but it was just too heavy to